Aristotle once described humans as the rational animal, and if you've ever gotten into an argument with someone about religion or politics, then you experienced how irrational people can be about their opinions. But what Aristotle meant is that rationality is a distinguishing characteristic. It is what sets us apart from the beasts. And no matter how much you disagree with someone about God or Donald Trump or Brexit or Meghan Markle, you can at least grant that they are not beasts. Because most of the time, at least people can be persuaded by arguments. You use arguments all the time on Facebook, at family dinners, with your friends. You probably just don't think of them the same way what philosophers do. When you try and convince your children to become independent, or when you are talking up some new movie or song to your friends, you are using arguments. Each time you tell someone to do or believe something, or when you are explaining why you do or believe something, you are giving an argument. The problem is, the vast majority of people aren't really good at arguments. We tend to confuse making a good argument with like having a witty comebacks or just making your points more loudly and angrily instead of building a case on a solid foundation of logic, which can be hard than it sounds. But learning about arguments and strong reasoning will not only make you a better philosopher, it will also set you up to be a more persuasive person. Someone who people will listen to, someone who's convincing. So, yeah, these skills are beneficial no matter what you want to do with your life. So, you might as well know how to argue properly. If you want to learn how to argue, then you should probably start about 2400 or 2500 years ago when Plato was laying out how reason can and should function in the human mind. He believed that we all have what he called a tripartite soul. First, there is the rational or logical part of the soul, which represents cool reason. But then there is the spirited aspect, often described as the emotional part of the self, although that doesn't really quite capture it. The spirited soul isn't just about feeling, it's also about how your feelings fuel your actions. The petitive part is what drives you to eat, engage in certain acts, protect yourself from danger, and so on. And then there is the 20th century British thinker, Bertrand Russell, one of the pioneers of what's known today as analytic psychology. Russell says, suppose there is a town in which all men are required by law to be clean shaven. This town has only one barber, a man who must follow strict rules. Rule number 1, he must shave all men who do not shave themselves. Rule number 2, he must not shave any man who does shave himself. But then here's the question, does the barber shave himself? Think about it. The barber only shaves men who don't shave themselves. So if he does shave himself, then he must not, because the barber's not allowed to shave guys who shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he has to be shaved by the barber, because that's the law. Russell came up with this puzzle to illustrate the fact that a group must always be a member of itself. That means, in this case, that all men who shave themselves has to include every guy who shaves himself, including the barber. Otherwise, the logic that dictates the group's existence just doesn't hold up. And if the barber is a logical impossibility, then he can't exist, which means the reasoning behind his existence is inherently flawed, and philosophy doesn't tolerate flawed reasoning.
Lord Russell, what is philosophy?
Well, that's a very controversial question. I think no two philosophers will give you the same answer. My own view would be that philosophy consists of speculations about matters where exact knowledge is not yet possible. But that will only be my answer, not anybody else's.
What's the difference between philosophy and science?
Well, roughly you'd say science is what we know and philosophy is what we don't know. That's a simple definition. And for that reason, Christians are perpetually passing over from philosophy into science as knowledge advances.
When something is established and discovered, it ceases to be philosophy and becomes science.
Yes. And all sorts of questions that used to be labeled philosophy are no longer so labeled.
What good is philosophy?
I think philosophy has two uses, really. One of them is to keep alive speculation about things that are not yet amenable to scientific knowledge. After all, scientific knowledge covers a very small part of the things that interest mankind and ought to interest them. There are a great many things of immense interest about which science, at present at any rate, has nothing to say. And I don't want people's imaginations to be limited and enclosed within what can be now known. And I think to enlarge your imaginative purview of the world into the hypothetical realm is one of the uses of philosophy. But there's another use which I think is equally important, which is to show that there are things we thought we knew and don't know. On the one hand, to keep us thinking about things that we may come to know, and on the other hand, to keep us modestly aware of how much that seemed like knowledge isn't knowledge.
Could you give some illustrations of the sort of subjects which have been speculated about and then produce some material result later?
Yes, it's quite easy to do so, especially from Greek philosophy. The Greeks invented a whole lot of hypotheses which turned out valuable later, but which in their day couldn't be tested. Take, for example, the atomic hypothesis. Democritus invented the atomic hypothesis that matter consists of little atoms. And after about 2,000 years, rather more than that, it turned out that this was the right scientific view. But in his day, it was merely a suggestion.
But didn't Plato think that Democritus's theory about atoms was a lot of nonsense?
Plato was horrified by him, said all his books ought to be burnt, because Plato didn't like science. He liked mathematics, but he didn't like anything else that was scientific.
Now, in this way, philosophy, in a sense, becomes a kind of servant of science.
Well, that's part of it. But, of course, it isn't only a servant of science, because there are a number of things that science can't deal with. All questions of values, for example. Science won't tell you what is good and what is bad. Tell you what is good or bad as an end, and not just as a means.
But what change has there been over the years in the attitude of philosophers and the public to philosophy, would you say?
Well, that depends upon the school of philosophy that you're thinking of. In Plato and in Aristotle, both of them, the main thing was an attempt to understand the world. And that, I should say personally, is what philosophy ought to be doing. But then you come on to the Stoics, and their emphasis was mainly on morality. That you ought to be stoical, you ought to endure misfortunes patiently. And that came to be the popular use of a philosopher.
Would you say that Marx was a philosopher?
Well, he was certainly in a sense a philosopher. But now there you have an important division among philosophers. There are some philosophers who exist to uphold the status quo, and others who exist to upset it, and Marx, of course, belongs to the second lot. For my part, I should reject both those as being not the true business of a philosopher. And I should say the business of a philosopher is not to change the world, but to understand it, which is the exact opposite of what Marx said.
What kind of a philosopher would you say you are?
Well, the only label I've of is logical atomist, but not very keen on the label. I've rather avoided labels.
What does that mean, a logical atomist?
It means, in my mind, that the way to get at the nature of any subject matter you're looking at is analysis, and that you can analyze until you get to things that can't be analyzed any further. And those would be logical atoms. I call them logical atoms because they're not little bits of matter. They're the, so to speak, ideas out of which a thing is built up.
What is the main trend of philosophy today?
Well, one would have to distinguish there between English-speaking countries and continental European countries. The trends are much more separate than they used to be, very much more. In English-speaking countries, and especially in England, there is a new philosophy which has arisen, I think, through the desire to find a separate field for philosophy. In what I was saying a moment ago, it would appear that philosophy is merely incomplete science, and there are people who don't like that view. They want to have science have a sphere, philosophy have a sphere to itself. That has led them into what you may call linguistic philosophy, that the important thing for the philosopher is not to answer questions, but to get the meaning of the questions quite clear. I can't myself agree to that view, but I could give an illustration. I was once bicycling to Winchester, and I lost my way, and I went to a village shop, and I said, can you tell me the shortest way to Winchester? And the man I asked called to a man in a back region whom I couldn't see. Gentleman wants to know the shortest way to Winchester. And the voice came back, Winchester? Aye. Way to Winchester? Aye. Shortest way? Aye. Don't know. And so I had to go on without getting an answer. Well, that is what Oxford philosophy thinks one should do.
We get the question right, never mind about the answer.
Yes, it's somebody else's business to give the answer.
How does this differ from the continental approach?
The continental approach is, well, it's more full-blooded. I don't agree with it anymore, but in a sense it's much more full-blooded and much more like philosophies of earlier times. There are various kinds. There's the philosophy that comes from Kierkegaard, existentialism, and then there are philosophies designed to provide apologetics for traditional religion. There are various things of that sort. I don't think myself that there's anything very important in all that.
What practical use is your sort of philosophy to a man who wants to know how to conduct himself?
A great many people write to me saying they are now completely puzzled as to how they ought to conduct themselves, because they've ceased to accept the traditional signposts to right action and don't know what others to adopt. And I think that the sort of philosophy I believe in is useful in this way, that it enables people to act with vigor when they're not absolutely certain that that is the right action. I think nobody should be certain of anything. If you're certain, you're certainly wrong, because nothing deserves certainty. And so one ought always to hold all one's beliefs with a certain element of doubt, and one ought to be able to act vigorously in spite of the doubt. After all, this is what a general does when he's planning a battle. He doesn't quite know what the enemy will do, but if he's a good general, he guesses right. If he's a bad general, he guesses wrong. But one has, in practical life, to act upon probabilities. And what I should look to philosophy to do is to encourage people to act with vigor, without complete certainty.
Yes, but now, how about this business, though, of making people so uncertain about things they'd sort of believed and had faith in? Doesn't that rather disturb them?
Well, it does for a time, of course. And I think a certain amount of disturbance is an essential part of mental training. But if they have any knowledge of science, they get a ballast which enables them to avoid being completely upset by the doubts that they ought to feel.
What do you think is the future of philosophy?
I don't think philosophy can in the future have anything like the importance that it had either to the Greeks or in the Middle Ages. I think the rise of science inevitably diminishes the importance of philosophy.
Well, would you summarize the value of philosophy?
First, because, as I say, it keeps you realizing that there are very big and very important questions that science, at any rate at present, can't deal with, and that a scientific attitude by itself is not adequate. And the second thing it does is to make people a little more modest intellectually and aware that a great many things which have been thought certain turned out to be untrue, and that there's no shortcut to knowledge, and that the understanding of the world, which to my mind is the underlying purpose that every philosopher should have, that is a very long and difficult business about which we ought not to be dogmatic.
Thank you, Lord Russell.
So how do we make sure that we are ruled by good, sound, not flawed reason? By perfecting the art of argument, an argument in philosophy isn't just a shouting match. Instead, philosophers maintain that your beliefs should always be backed up by reasons, which we call premises. Premises form the structure of your argument. They offer evidence for your belief, and you can have as many premises as you like as long as they support your conclusion, which is the thing that you actually believe. There are actually several different species of arguments. Probably the most familiar and the easiest to carry out is the deductive argument. The main rule of the deductive argument is, if your premises are true, then your conclusion must be true. And knowing that something is actually true is very rare and awesome. So here's a boiled down version of a good deductive argument. Premise 1, all humans are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a human. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. This kind of reasoning, where one fact leads to another, is called entailment. Once we know that all humans are mortal and that Socrates is a human, those facts entail that Socrates is immortal. Deduction begins with the general, in this case, what we know about human morality, the reasons down to the specific, Socrates in particular. What's great about deductive logic is that the truth of the premises must lead to the truth of the conclusion. When this happens, we say that the argument is valid. There's just no way for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. Now check out this argument. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates was Plato's teacher. The argument is invalid because nothing about human morality can prove that Socrates was Plato's teacher. As you might have noticed, there are plenty of mortal humans who never taught about Plato. Now that's interesting though. Is this argument does happen to have a true conclusion, which leads us to another issue, and that is validity is not the same as truth. Now, how do you know that aspirin will take care of your headache? Why do you really want to see that new Star Wars movie, even though you haven't heard anything about it, good or bad? Your ability to do things like predict how a medication will affect you, or what movie you might like, or even things like what the perfect gift might be for your best friend, or what's the fastest way to get to school, all of this stuff you know through induction. Deductive arguments are great because they give us certain answers. But unfortunately, much of the world cannot be summed up in a neat deductive proof. Deduction requires a fair amount of general information to give you a specific conclusion that is probably kind of obvious. So philosophy and basically life as well require that you have other ways of reasoning. In addition to knowing how one fact leads to another, you also need to take what you experienced before and use that to predict what might happen in the future. And you need to be able to rule out what can't be true, so you can focus on what can. Through these kinds of reasoning, you are not only able to figure out stuff like how to fix your headache and why your friend might be acting weird, you can also come up with better, more skillful arguments and counter-arguments, which are some of the most important maneuvers in philosophical game. If you possess the ability to really predict the future, it lies in your ability to reason inductively. Inductive reasoning relies on the predictability of nature to reveal that the future is likely to resemble the past, often in important ways. For example, there's tons of research to support the knowledge that aspirin is an effective treatment for pain, just like headaches. And you probably have personal experience that the effects of aspirin too. So you believe that this aspirin tablet will cure the headache you have right now, because countless aspirin tablets have cured countless headaches in the past. Likewise, you want to see the new Star Wars movie because you liked most of the other ones. So you believe that they'll continue to deliver for you, particularly in terms of entertainment. But it's important to remember that unlike deduction, where true premises entail true conclusions, inductive premises only mean that the conclusion is likely to be true. Inductive arguments don't provide you with certainty. Instead, they work in terms of probabilities, and they are useful for more than just predicting what's going to happen. For example, most men in ancient Athens had beards. Socrates was a man who lived in ancient. Most men in ancient Athens had beards. Socrates was a man who lived in ancient Athens. Therefore, Socrates probably had a beard. This is an inductive argument because it starts with what we already know about the grooming habits of ancient Athenian men and about the time and place in which Socrates lived, and makes an educated guess based on that information. There is no guarantee that the conclusion is correct, but what's known would seem to support it. Reasoning like this is incredibly useful, which is why it's so common. But there's also a problem. The future doesn't always resemble the past, and every pattern has its outliers, something that stands out from the others. So induction always has the potential to produce false results. Aspirin might not work on a really bad headache. The new Star Wars movie might be awful, and yeah, maybe a specific guy in Athens had a beard, but it's possible he didn't. Thank you.